Good evening. Welcome to the Restore the Joy series here at our church. Thank you for joining. If you're tuning in online, thank you for tuning in. We hope that you will learn some more cool things about how to live a wonderful life. I believe that God wants us to live lives of abundance. And this week, our speaker is going to share some tips, some steps, some ways in which we can live a great life and really restore the joy in our hearts. Because I don't know if you felt it, but ever since 2020, which kind of is kind of a buzzkill word, if you think about it, ever since 2020, it just kind of feels like people are maybe a little bit more annoyed, maybe agitated, maybe a little bit more tired or frustrated. And so how can we restore our joy maybe to what it was like before, or maybe even like it was never before? That's what we would like to look at this week. Before we continue, I just have a couple of announcements that I would like to share with you. First of all, you will have received a Connect card like this. Please fill it in and connect with us. We'd like to follow up with you. If this is your first time here and you'd like to connect with us, please get one of these. If you didn't get one, they are out front. You can fill one in on your way out and just drop it in the box. One of the things you can do on there as well is if you'd like to meet with our presenter, he has said that he would be willing to meet at certain times, and we can arrange that. If you have questions that you'd like to ask him, maybe over a beverage or something like that, we could arrange that. The other thing is there will be a prize drawing every night for those who attend in person. So it's kind of like an incentive for attending in person. And so make sure that you fill one of these in. Your prize could be a book. It could be a gift card to a local restaurant. So you just don't know what you're going to get on the night, but it will be worth it. So make sure that you have that as well. I'd like to say a word of prayer, and I will introduce our speaker, and then we will begin. Our Heavenly Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you that we can come together in this place, in person or online, and learn more about life and really the joy that life can be. I pray that you will be with us, that you will help open our hearts and our minds to learn more. It's my prayer in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Craig Carr is our speaker this evening, and he is a lifelong follower of Jesus. He's a pastor. He loves reading, traveling, photography, and running. In fact, Craig started running, was it 2017 or 18?
Thereabouts. Yeah.
Thereabouts.
Yeah.
Started running, and he's never stopped. He's never missed a day ever since starting.
Crazy. Yeah.
Right? That's pretty impressive. He has completed he completes about 40 miles a week, and you've done you do 4 marathons a year. That's incredible. Yeah. Craig works as the ministerial director for the Mid-America Union of Seventh-day Adventists down in Lincoln, Nebraska. He is married to one wife, Carissa.
One wife.
And Craig, thank you for being here on your wife's birthday.
Yes.
We know that's a sacrifice she made. We might have to send Carissa a card. But I'm excited to hear what Craig has to share with us. Topics of work-life balance, emotional well-being, how to deal with stress, and all these things are a passion for him. And as you listen to him, you will realize that passion as well. Thank you, Craig.
Cool.
I'll turn the time over to you.
Sure. Well, good evening, everybody. It is really cool to be in Bismarck. Man, the wind just blew me in here. This past week, I drove from Lincoln to Berrien Springs, Michigan, in southwest Michigan. And there's something about driving in the openness of the freeway and the cornfields and all that that varies from the traffic just outside Chicago. Now, I don't know about any of you, but traffic is not my favorite activity. Have you ever noticed how you become a different person when you're driving it? Maybe it's just me, so this is just confession. I've lived in Denver, I've lived in Seattle, but Lincoln is wonderful. If there's 5 cars ahead of me at a stoplight, that's traffic, so that's wonderful. Road rage is real. Perhaps you have been on the receiving end, of course, but I even see signs along the road that will talk about road rage. On my way here today, I traveled to Denver and had a couple hours there, and then traveled here, and just standing in line for something today, somebody cut in front of me, and somebody said, "Hey," and I was like, I just sort of stepped aside. I said, "Oh, are you in a hurry?" And he just kind of went on, and it's like, okay. What I hope as we talk tonight and as we talk some more later this week, that you will sense that God has not called you to the culture of hustle and hurry that we see all around us. I grew up in a time of after the invention of some labor-saving devices, like, I've always known what a dishwasher was. I've always known what a washing machine was and a dryer. But, my grandparents, my grandma would spend hours and hours, doing the laundry and hanging it up on the line. And we just toss it in a little soap, hit a button, and we forget about it until it dings or whatever at it. Then we go and we throw it in the dryer. I mean, it's just so simple. And yet, what do we fill that time that we're saving with? All these labor-saving, time-saving devices. What do we do with all that extra time? Well, we fill it with other stuff, right? There is a book I'll reference a little bit later in the week that its title really says it all. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And it's like this calling to slow down, to pace yourself a little bit. Now, there are times that we need to move and move quickly. If the fire alarm were to go off right now, we would all want to calmly make our way out to the exit and not stand around a visit and, "Oh, how's the weather?" There's times to move speedily. However, it just seems that we have fallen into a default mode of hurry and scurry. And it does something to our mind. It does something to our emotions. It does something to our relationships. It does something to our blood pressure. Its effects are all around us, and it's created kind of a new normal. And so this week is almost a calling back to a different normal. Maybe we'll just call it God's normal for a little bit. And this quest began about 15 years ago when a friend of mine with whom I'd gone to college, and he became a pastor. I became a pastor a little bit later on. I have a business degree and did some things in healthcare administration and whatnot until I finally went into pastoral ministry. But my friend had all the right ingredients. Very talented, comfortable up front, loved to do ministry, loved to give Bible studies. He loved every aspect except board meetings. Well, it wasn't just board meetings. It was whenever there was conflict. And what I watched my friend, who will remain nameless, go through was he enjoyed so many aspects of his work, as I'm sure do you, but there were certain things that just really ate his lunch and really stressed him out. And so maybe in your workplace, you find that you can be going along, having a great day, and then some sort of encounter takes place and it creates something in you. It literally triggers something in you and you kind of get upset or anxious or stressed. There's a whole lot of different words we use. We're really quite talented at the vocabulary we use to describe this unsettling thing. Well, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But I wanted to address this whole idea of what leads a person to burn out from their job. Mainly a service-oriented type where you're constantly interacting with people all the time. And that can take on many different shapes. And certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen what some refer to as the Great Resignation. Healthcare is hurting for workers because so many of them reached their limit. And they said, for my own emotional health, I've got to step back from what I'm doing, caring for others. Now, is caring for others a good thing? Absolutely it is. But what toll it was taking on the healthcare workers and many other service-oriented professions was just too much. And they said, I got to call a timeout. I got to call a timeout. One of the underlying things that is going on in each of us is anxiety. Now, when I say the word anxiety, you might travel over here in your mind and think, well, that's nervousness. Or you might travel over here and associate it with, well, anxiety is kind of related to depression. Or anxiety is something that wells up and it comes out in reactivity. And guess what? You're all right. It's sort of like the active ingredient that all of us have in us that comes out in the most personalized ways, given your temperament and your personality, how you were raised as a child, what you consider to be normal, what kind of profession you kind of found your way into. All these kind of things contribute to how you handle anxiety. Well, I was speaking with a group of preachers a week ago. While I was in Berrien Springs, I spoke to a couple of the classes there of those that are training to be pastors. And I shared this article, just one sentence that I kind of separated out into bullet points. But now this is just for pastors, but you might be able to relate to it in your line of work, okay? But this author said that there are 5 clergy killers. That was really captivating language that he used there, right? And they are criticism, conflict, unrealistic expectations, resistance to change, and high stress. Now, please don't raise your hand, but do any of you like any of those 5 when it comes right down to it? Whoa! I met someone who says, I enjoy conflict. I took a couple steps back. Okay. You know, if we just take a look at criticism, it's one thing to criticize the color of someone's car. So you don't like red. That's okay. Not everybody has to like red. And if you criticize my tie, I'm not wearing a tie, but you know, that's a little more connected to me. If you criticize something within my character, ooh, that's what starts to begin to kind of feel, oh. And that creates a little bit of a reaction inside of us. Criticism. Conflict. Later this week, we'll talk about understanding family systems in which there are very predictable ways in which we all act. And once we sort of recognize that roadmap of how others react and particularly how we react, particularly when under anxiety, then things begin to make a little more sense and we can navigate things in a little healthier way. But that's just a little preview for a couple of nights from now. unrealistic expectations are always around us. When I boarded the plane today in Lincoln, Nebraska, I expected it would leave on time. Then the pilot came on and said that we've been asked to stay put for 20 minutes before leaving. But then he said, but we're still going to make it on we'll still make an on-time arrival. Well, then why did you make me get on this big lead bus and sit down if we weren't going to leave for another 20 minutes but still get there on time? But he's the pilot, and actually pilots are hard to find as well, because that's also a stressful job. But so I expected to leave a little earlier. There are many times in which the things we expect don't happen, or they happen in a different manner, and that can often create some anxiety within us as well. Resistance to change. Change is hard. Change often represents losing something I've been used to, and it's comfortable. But of course, the person promoting it, but this is going to be so much better, right? Well, I haven't been to better yet. How do I know? I kind of like the way things have been and the way they are. And sometimes we have a choice of that change, and we kind of, well, okay. Other times it just plop right in our lap. Here's the way it's going to be. Whoa, now I've got to adjust to that. Lastly, high stress. Just another way of describing, I think, in the last 4 years or so, I'll try to avoid the year 20. That was a really tough year on us all, and that 5-letter word begins with C, not Craig, but a different word, has a V in the middle. But I believe that the water level of society's anxiety has risen. And it's all around us. But I believe as Christians, we have been called to live our lives differently than the rest of the world. And yet we still got to live and breathe and function and interact with the world around us, right? We're always reacting to and adjusting to the environment around us. But I think of Paul's words, and I kind of trip over my own tongue every time I read them. Did he really mean be anxious for nothing? I mean, nothing? I can think back over the last week of things that I have gotten anxious about, and mostly they were things that I did not have control over. But I was worrying about. That's another code word for being anxious, that we worry. But Paul says, be anxious for nothing. And in the following verses, which aren't on the screen, but he gives us a recipe of how to achieve that. We make our requests known to God, the one who cares for us, the one who knows our circumstances, the one who God became flesh and dwelt among us through his son Jesus. He knows what it's like to live on this earth as a human. So certainly we can let our anxieties, our worries, our troubles known to God. And then the next phrase is, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and your minds. That's calling us to a different way of living, isn't it? But when I sometimes think about be anxious for nothing, I go, really? Is it possible? I'll skip over that there. Our buddy Jim. So how would you, not how Webster, but how would you describe anxiety? Because we all experience it in a little different way. Perhaps it's an uneasy feeling. Perhaps it's a nervousness. Perhaps it's fear. Perhaps it's anger. It can take on, it's anxiety is almost like the little spark that lights something, and then depending on what you're experiencing, it could be a whole variety of things. I want to offer a few suggestions. It could just simply be a general uneasy feeling about something. I'm feeling anxious about something. And before we go too much further, I want to just pause because that's part of the recipe when addressing anxiety. You see, God wired us to be able to respond to emergencies, right? And there are all manner, cortisol and not Benadryl, but some of those other chemicals that are released, adrenaline in our bodies that, yes, I'm sure it's not Benadryl, but there are chemicals released in our bodies that activate us to action, right? And much of it happens without the involvement of your brain. If I reach out my hand and accidentally touch the stove, is my brain going to go, what's that smell? No, our nervous system immediately tells us to jerk our hand back, right? Because we were in danger. God wired us that way to automatically respond to certain situations. But what about those times in which we feel anxious with other people? Again, your life is not in danger. There's no imminent physical threat. And yet a lot of those same chemicals are involved when you get anxious and angry, upset with someone else. That we have to factor in those automatic responses and then the responses we have choices over. Again, I get ahead of myself. Sometimes anxiety can just be from stress. Sometimes it's just it's like an unknown sort. You're just worried and anxious about something. It could be situational anxiety. We forget that public speaking is among the top 5 fears that people have, right? Have you ever been kind of nervous, before going up front to give a presentation or about a conversation that's involving some conflict with a friend, whatever, and feeling anxious about that, and relationship anxiety, tension, conflict, miscommunications. I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news. This is just kind of, life that we interact with around us. But thank the Lord, we're going to find some ways that we can deal with it in a healthy way. Cultural anxiety, again, the general level of anxiety with our neighbors and the people we interact with in public, it's just different. I'd like to think that I'm an optimist, and in between the optimist and the pessimist is the realist, somewhere in there, I guess. But I know that in 2024, everything is not Andy Griffith, Mayberry, and yet I think that the rapid fire succession that life throws at us, and the impatient and even unkind and different things that go on around us, we're called to make choices how we respond. Even if that first response, that automatic response is, hey, right? Well, lastly, the chronic anxiety, that stuck feeling we can find ourselves in, that uneasy, that worried, that I just don't feel safe anymore, or my life feels out of balance. There are layers, like an onion, there are layers and layers to each of our anxiety level. And certainly, the more layers and the deeper we find ourselves being anxious, I think the more help we need around us. And I would certainly not claim to be a mental health professional, but I know those that have received wonderful help and blessing from receiving treatment of various forms to help them, that cloud of anxiety to break up and lift and to lead a happier life. Well, Oxford Dictionary defines it as a feeling of worry, nervousness, uneasy, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Well, that kind of sounds like every morning when I get out of bed. I don't know what's going to happen, right? I do know that my body will signal me when I get anxious. A case in point, I was in Denver a few weeks ago, and I was driving a rental car, and you know, the gas pedals on rental cars push down a little differently than the one I own. But I'm traveling along, and as you could guess, I saw Christmas lights in my rearview mirror. Not red and green, mind you, but red and blue. And I didn't meet Santa that day, but I did meet a man in uniform, a sergeant, pulled me over right in front of Cherry Hills Country Club. I thought, what a contrast. Here I'm thinking I might go to jail, and there's millionaires that drive down this little path to this golf club and whatever every day. And so, anyway, I could feel my heart rate was faster than it had been just a moment before. And I kind of, well, okay. I never know what to do with my hands. You know, do I put them here? Do I put them here? But this very kind and very polite officer walked up to my window and asked me if I knew why he had pulled me over. And I said, "Officer, honestly, I do not know." And that was the truth. I didn't know. But I wasn't going to say, "But I can't wait for you to tell me." You know? I mean, we have to use our senses. There are things that we want to say when we're anxious that we should not. Have you ever said, "Honey, I'm sorry"? Punch the person beside you and just say, "Sorry." Because you probably says, anyway. So I was in a school zone. I was going a speed that begins with a 4. And we had a nice conversation, and he told me to slow down. Gave me his business card. So I didn't get a ticket that day, and my heart rate returned to normal. The anxiety of the situation went like this. We encounter things all the time that kind of get us charged up. And in fact, anxiety and adrenaline is to your advantage when you're seeking to do something like public speaking or an important conversation. It keeps us sharp. It keeps us on edge. And we're more present and in that moment. And then later, that kind of subsides, and we kind of go back to, normal state. But anyway, it's an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, even physical changes, increased blood pressure. Case in point right here, right? People with anxiety disorders, again, a few layers more deeply than others might experience, recurring intrusive thoughts or concerns. They may avoid certain situations out of worry. There were people during COVID who would not leave their home out of fear. That anxiousness turned to fear, and it was just a hunker down, I'm not leaving. I lived in Seattle at the time, and there was not a day that I didn't see at least 20 Amazon vans delivering stuff to people. You can pretty much live a life and never leave your house. If you have a smartphone, it can order everything that you need, and it just shows up on your doorstep. I'm not encouraging that, but it is amazing how isolating we can be, and yet we don't really question it because it's so convenient to do that. Well, anxiety is not the same as fear, although we often use those terms interchangeably. Anxiety is considered a future-oriented, long-acting response broadly focused on a diffuse threat, not a real threat, but a diffuse, like a foggy sort of threat. I'm not even sure where it's coming at me from, whereas fear is more present-oriented, short-lived, and identifiable and specific. So fear would be, I'm fearing that snake that's in the path of my hiking trail, whereas anxiety is almost like the atmosphere around me. This slide describes all of us to some degree. There is your actual self, and then there is your adaptive self. Your actual self is in your comfy clothes on your favorite chair at home. It's just who we are. And, all jokes aside, it's the person your family knows you to be. And I haven't yet met a perfect person, and we're all a work in progress. So none of this means that you've arrived, but it's just who you are and the way your family loves you. Well, your adaptive self is how you show up to work, how you show up at other social engagements, other gatherings. It doesn't mean you're faking, but you are adapting yourself a little bit in order to kind of get along with that person or what the situation is calling for. The further apart these two things are, the more tension it creates in you. Doesn't that make sense? I'll give an example using the introvert and extrovert. The introvert who doesn't mind talking with people, they just need to go away and leave me alone after a while, right? The introvert loves to sit at home and read a book on a Saturday night. I didn't hear any amens, but that's okay. The extrovert wants to be around lots of people on that Saturday night, right? Let's invite a bunch of people over and let them stay as long as they want, and you look for your introvert spouse and they're gone. They're like in the back bedroom, Have they left yet? Kind of thing. And it's funny how God tends to bring extrovert and introvert, hello, dum, dum, da, dum. And that's just kind of how it works, whether it's the wife, the husband, whatever. But introverts and extroverts, every once in a while, extroverts have to stop and listen and be calm, like sitting in church. And every once in a while, an introvert has to make a presentation at work or teach a class. It's like, ugh. And what we're talking about is interacting with the world that you're less comfortable with, and we all get to do it, or have to do it once in a while. But it's uncomfortable, it's adaptive, it requires more gas. It's like driving across Nebraska into a headwind. Your gas gauge, wow, your energy level, it takes more emotional energy to adapt to the situation. That's why you feel tired. For the extrovert that has to do the presentation, they go 20 minutes over their time because they're having such a great time, making people laugh, and they're just having it, and they've got all this energy. Afterwards, they won't be quiet. They just keep going. The Energizer Bunny, it's just, whoa. And so that's their actual self. That's their being. The other is our doing. We have to kind of, all right, I'll do it. But whether it's your vocation or whether it's the relationships you find yourself in, all of us to some degree must adapt certain behaviors, our tendencies. It's the person we need to be in those situations. But again, the closer these two things can be, the more relaxed we'll be. The less energy it'll require of us. And the less anxious we will be. But again, I'm not saying one should avoid the other. It's just having that self-awareness of knowing, I feel pretty comfortable over here, but I'm willing to step over here for a season, and then I'm going to step back, right? So having that awareness. So I want to go over 5 characteristics of a chronically anxious system. This could be a family. This could be a workplace. This could be a classroom. This could be any gathering of people. Where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there will be anxiety. There are very predictable ways that people behave. One of them is reactivity. You know what reactivity looks like, don't you? Oh, I know you do. I know you do. What if, just for fun, a trained fireman or firewoman was very highly reactive? They show up on the scene and the house is on fire, and the owner comes out and says, help me, my house is on fire. And the fireman says, oh no, your house is on fire. That's reactivity. That's simply matching the anxiety that's being presented to you. Or if that police officer or EMT or fireman meets that and says, ma'am, we want you to sit over here. It's going to be okay. We're going to go in and take care of it. In that calming voice, in that everything's going to be fine kind of voice. I never want the flight attendants on my airplane to have to use that voice. Okay, you're with me. It's being able to maintain calm versus the, oh no, the sky is falling kind of reactivity, okay? Blame displacement has been around since Adam and Eve. We kind of recall the story there in the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings. It explains so much about God, it explains so much about humanity, and God comes looking for Adam and Eve. And when he finds them, he asks, what'd you guys do? Well, she did it, was Adam's response. And the Eve, who, me? Well, there was that serpent in the tree that you made. We were wired to not just naturally accept the blame for stuff that happens. I remember as a child even trying to blame the dog, I mean, we try to avoid it, block it away from us. And when we do so, we're not accepting responsibility for what may be our role in a problem. And it's very difficult. Blame displacement goes right along with defensiveness, which is another form of reactivity. They work together, don't they? And when you're talking with someone about a challenge or a problem, we have to mark our words and not use the word you too much, especially in that tone, you. But I noticed that this is a concern, that kind of language. But when you're talking with someone that has a high level of defensiveness, at some point you're like, they're not hearing me. Their anxiety is so high, and they're trying to deflect what we're even talking about, that I got to call a timeout. They're not even hearing me at this point. All they can do is defend themselves or blame others, right? So again, this is when there's anxiety in a family or any sort of system. The quick fix mentality. Who's got duct tape in their car? Yeah, my favorite kind of people. The quick fix mentality is not necessarily about the right solution. It's about relieving the anxiety. Just, all right. So sometimes when we're feeling anxious, first of all, our emotions are in control, not our rational thinking. We'll talk about that when we talk about emotional intelligence a little bit later this week, I think Tuesday. But because our rational thoughts are not going on as quickly as our emotions are, we're really not that creative. We're actually in survival mode. We have very, very limited thoughts and solutions. And it's really, once we're able to kind of calm down a little bit, that our reason kind of, oh, well, what if we tried this? Or how about that? The quick fix, again, is less about solving the problem and much more about just trying to move on. When I say hurting, it's not, for those online, it's not hurting, and it's not having to do with your hearing. This is like a herd of sheep. And whether there was an old term used in business literature in the 80s and 90s called groupthink, but it's a process in which literally nobody is really doing a whole lot of thinking about the solution, but they're talking and people sort of gather around and press together, if you will, but no one's really doing their own individual thinking about that particular challenge. So they just herd, and it's unhealthy, not healthy, when we think about that. Togetherness triumphs over individuality, and we'll talk about some of that a little more. And then a lack of well-differentiated leaders, those that are willing to not cave to the anxiety, not trying to displace it or blame it, but are willing to just sort of live in the tension for a minute, because it doesn't last forever, sometimes for a while, but to allow reasoning to return, to, let's talk about, one of the greatest tools God has given us is a spirit of curiosity. Curiosity will save your striples when you get anxious. I mean, think about it. When you get anxious and you get into these modes of being reactive, like, oh no! How about, I wonder what's going on here? That's a much different question than, who did this? Right? Be curious, not accusatory. It'll save you from the reactivity, the blame displacement, even from trying to get to a quick and dirty solution, to be curious. So the 5 mature responses to chronically anxious systems. There's that word curious, but observing, listening, and this is really hard. It's one thing to type the letters and put them up on the screen, but when I'm feeling really upset, I'll use that word that we can all kind of relate to. I'm not being very contemplative and leaning in, tell me more, I'm like, So to be observant and to be a good listener, listening to understand, not listening to respond, right? That's a discipline. That's a practice. So often we listen to the first few words and then we're thinking about how we can respond to zing, right back, and we don't even hear the rest. Now this is a really good time to not look at the person next to you. Okay. To manage self. We'll talk a lot about this in a couple of nights when we talk about emotional intelligence. But managing self, you are the only person that can control you by God's grace. And for some of us, it requires a lot of grace. But again, if you think you can control someone close to you, let alone someone far away from you, we can waste a lot of time trying to do that. But managing self and not taking on the anxiety of others, and then remaining in contact. What I mean by that is leaning in rather than running away. people, or I should say personalities, that cause you to be anxious, you want to walk the other way. You want to, that's another form of avoiding, right? You want to emotionally cut off your involvement with that person, but an emotionally mature person can still engage with people that might cause them to be upset once in a while. We'll talk more about that on Wednesday night, but remaining in contact is important to do, because if we don't, pretty soon our list of friends gets kind of short. So I can't talk to that person. Oh, I don't get along with that. Oh, I could never see that person. It's just like, where can you go after a while? Thinking in systems, and we'll talk about this later in the week too, but defining yourself thoughtfully, logically. I love the fact that in the book of John, the final of the 4 Gospels that was written much later in his life, I think after a lot of reflection and talking with people, John penned the book of John, named it after himself, I know. But the Gospel of John has these beautiful statements of Jesus where he says, I am. And these statements are I am the good shepherd. I am the door. I am the light of the world. And there's 8 of them. And what he's doing is he is defining his character to others so that they know how to relate to him. He's revealing himself to his disciples, to his followers. And every once in a while, it's okay to say I, if you're ready to listen to the other I. Well, I think this. What do you think? Sometimes we need to say I. This is what I think. We might even say, this is what I think, change my mind. Or, I know we disagree, but we both might learn something here. If we could just stay in this tension a little bit, we might both walk away with a better understanding. We might still think just the way we did before. But again, maturity allows us to lean in as opposed to run away. And then letting our core values, we'll spend some time Friday night talking about core values and guiding principles. So here's the rest of that wonderful text, which I'm sure I slaughtered trying to quote it, but we're gonna read this, Philippians 4, 6, and 7. I'm reading out of the New Living Translation. I love reading the Bible through each year, but every couple years I do a different translation, kind of thing. Sometimes it's NIV or New King James, and this year it's NLT. Don't worry about anything. Now that sounds like somebody's selling you something. Don't worry about anything, right? What are you up to? What's going on? This is Paul's words, and it's followed by these wonderful words. Instead, pray about everything. There are probably a few prayers in the house. Prayers, those that pray. For those watching online, prayer is just simply opening your heart to God as to your best friend who has your best interest in mind and might communicate what you need to hear, not always what you want to hear. But pray. Pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him in advance for all He has done, both in the past as well as the future. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. It's just this mind-blowing peace. His peace will guard your hearts and your minds as you live in Christ Jesus. A relationship with Jesus offers us a new life, a new way of interacting with the stuff around us. This is the kind of joy that I hope we can restore in all of our lives. What else does the Bible say about anxiety? You can search for the word fear. It's been said that do not be afraid or do not fear is recorded in various ways 365 times in Scripture, one for every day, except for leap year. But you can make it through February 29. It's okay. Do not fear. I love the Christmas stories. Every time an angel shows up, they're frightened. And the first words the angel says is, do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy, right? They're like, man, this is great stuff. Don't be afraid. Okay, Psalm 55:22, cast your burden upon the Lord. He will sustain you. Peace I leave with you, Jesus said in John 14. Oh, I love Psalm 46:10. It's so simple, so simple. Be still. We'll talk about this text some more tomorrow night. Be still. You know, there are some people that can't be still. When I would sit with my brother in church, the pew would shake up and down like this. You look down the pew and his leg was just moving like this. I mean, could never stop. Be still. And no, I mean, it's just physically hard for him to sit still. But there are times, particularly when we're feeling anxious, that we need to be still and know that God is God. He is who He says He is. Let Him do all the God things, and you do your thing in comparison. Be strong and of good courage. You notice where that's found in the book of Deuteronomy, in the fifth book. This is where Moses is handing over the reins to Joshua, and Joshua knows just how hard the job is, and that's why he's saying, "But be strong, brother. Have good courage. See you later." I will both lie down in peace and sleep. And I think that's also kind of humorous, the whole extrovert, introvert, versus couples that you both hit the bed at the same time, and one is out like that, and the other one, it's like, takes a while to fall asleep, right? I see you looking at each other. I see you. Okay. It's all right. Just one more slide here, and then I've got some thought questions for you to consider before we finish up tonight. But my last name is Carr, so you have to kind of go with me a little bit on this automobile illustration. But if you think about a dashboard is designed to indicate a bunch of stuff that's going on, some of which you can see, and some you can't see. It's happening under the hood or someplace else in the vehicle that you can't, from the driver's seat, physically see. But if a light comes on, that's to indicate something's wrong. Maybe it's the gas gauge. How many in the house are full tankers? Man, every opportunity you fill her up. How many are empty tankers? You see just how far into the red you can go. I pulled into Costco gas station one time, and it's 0 miles to empty. My wife just shakes her head. I tested that same theory with my daughter, and we ran out of gas. Just a quarter mile from the gas station, but it was something that she's not let me forget. The fuel gauge and the battery are indicators of how much energy you have at that particular moment. How much energy. Sometimes the battery gets low, and when do you notice it? When it's a nice warm day like today? Oh no. When it's freezing cold and your car won't start. When there's a bit more on the line. Oh man, it won't start. Well, I won't go into people using or not using their turn signals. What I want you to notice is the RPM and the speed. Those are very, and underneath the RPM is the little thing that you can reset. This is a wonderful thing in life. If you're not in a very particularly enjoyable season of your life, Lord, help me reset. Set it back to zeros and let me start again. It's called forgiveness. Oh, grace. So grateful for. Now, the miles, I have been alive for 20,184 days. It's really easy. You just say, hey, Siri, how many days has it been since your birthday? And she'll tell you. So that's the miles I have on this chassis, and there's really not much choice about it. Every day adds a day, right? Every day adds a mile, right? There's an interesting thing about being human, just like with cars. There's these other things called Carfax. When you go to buy a used vehicle, you want to see the Carfax. What's the Carfax? It's the history of that vehicle, whether it's been in accidents, whether it's been serviced appropriately. We all have a history. We all have a Carfax, like it or not. But I'm thankful for a God who like the trip, we can reset. We can have a new beginning. This idea that God's mercies are new every morning. But once we get past this idea of a Carfax, then we come to Kelley Blue Book. And that's where we compare ourselves to other people, where we actually think about our value in comparison to others around us. This is not how God intended it, but we do it anyway. The owner's manual is kind of like the Bible. I mean, every instruction to live a joyous life is there. And even as complicated and weird as this world is getting, there are some incredible principles in there. You've heard of the Big 10? 10 rules. At this point, the U.S. government has 3.5 million laws. I guess our elected officials think they need to, keep adding, so that it appears that they're working. But the owner's manual is how to care for ourselves. And yes, you came with a warranty. Isn't this wonderful news? You were born to this world with a warranty that Jesus has already paid the bill for. I love this idea that if you break, you can be fixed. And guess what? It's a lifetime warranty. You don't get to I suppose if you got to 100,000 miles, if I'm only 20,000, you'd be really old. But, wow. Hey, Siri, no. But you're broken, but you're covered. You're covered. And that's where we get our truest identity, not from the Kelley Blue Book, but knowing that Jesus paid for our warranty. And that's who we are, sons and daughters of God. Well, there's other things on here like temperature. I'm not sure how that E wandered down there to the next line. It was feeling very independent, I guess. But temperament, I said the word. Temperature versus temperament. When you start feeling a little hot on the back of your neck, when you start feeling a little angry, you might get a little flushed. We all have certain physical signs, whether it's we start perspiring or that heart rate or whatever it might be. Our body knows, even before our mouth does sometimes, that we're angry. So what is this dashboard all about? It's about being self-aware. This is an incredible tool to be able to behave yourself, but also how to interact with other people in a healthy way. It's no wonder, and I mistakenly didn't put the verse with this, but it's no wonder that David, in his Psalms, wonderful, wonderful poems and songs that he put together, one of them is, "Search me, O God. Make me aware." Again, this is not something you can do by yourself, so it really isn't self-aware. It's God, reveal to me a clearer picture. And by doing so, reveal a clearer picture of your grace, because I'm going to need it. right? So we'll talk a little bit more about self-awareness. If on your dashboard it says maintenance required, if that light comes on, that's not a time for the duct tape to put over that. Ignore it. And yet many of us do. And it ends up in panic attacks. It can lead to cardiac arrest. It can lead to a lot of various physical problems when we've allowed that maintenance required light to shine brighter and brighter and brighter. We know we're wearing down. We know we're carrying too much of a burden. We know we need to rest. So those are just some of the indications of self-awareness. So some questions to think about as we close up here. What everyday life situations cause you to be anxious? Something to think about this week. What everyday things that sort of happen in everyday life cause you to be anxious? There was a season in our lives when we didn't have much money, and going to get the mail caused me to be anxious. Why? Because there were often bills. I mean, now it just electronically disappears from my bank account. Y'all know that. I mean, it goes in and then whoosh, it goes right out again. But, you know, we used to get actual envelopes with things that you open up, and there was this amount staring at you that you owed. And that would just cause my heart rate to, we don't have enough money or whatever else. And so it's often finances that can create a great deal of anxiety individually and in marriages. And so it was a number of years that I finally realized, you know, I don't like to get the mail. And it's not about walking down to the mailbox. It would make me think back to that season of life where we just didn't have enough money to pay all the bills that were coming in. See, there are things, we'll talk again a little bit later this week, but there are things that will trigger us in the present that have nothing to do with the present. But we're remembering something from the past. Okay, we'll talk more about that. Okay, what is your typical first reaction when you feel anxious or stressed? Think about it. What is your typical first reaction when you get anxious or stressed? That is the actual self. That's just who you are. And then there's the adaptive self, right? That if you realize that there are certain things that cause you to be angry, you need to kind of pause for just a moment so that you're able to adapt that anger a little more constructively and not take it out on everybody around you, right? Because you've been triggered. But your first reaction. What is a healthy coping mechanism that helps calm you down? There are unhealthy coping mechanisms called alcohol and nicotine and many other addictions. They're often coping mechanisms that people early in life fell into and they can't get out. Extremely addictive, and it's just how you deal with stress or how you deal with life. A little more commonly acceptable coping mechanism is food in any and all forms, right? Whatever your coping mechanisms may be, may it add, not subtract, to your health, physically and mentally, emotionally, right? One of my coping mechanisms, as you might know, is running. Running is not just a physical thing, it's an emotional release. I can kind of go out there and just tell God what's happening, you know, as I'm out there running, and then I go back and shower it off and I start my day, you know. But the way that we deal with the difficulties of life, how we cope, is an important question to answer for ourselves because, again, it can tend to be an automatic response. It just happens that quick. You don't even realize. So again, as a part of self-awareness, being aware of your natural coping mechanisms. We're not going to go through all this, but this is the last slide for tonight, and we're going to get into some of these a little bit later this week. But these are some of the elements of family systems theory, which kind of puts all in the same place or on the same table much of what we've already discussed. But in a very simple way, family systems is understanding how anxiety moves through a system. And it's not so much about trying to control the other people in your family or in your workplace or in the church, but seeking to have self-awareness and control yourself. Again, by God's grace alone. But these are some of the observable ways that we tend to respond. We've already mentioned some of them, but we'll unpack some of these a little bit more. Tonight was sort of an introduction to some of them. But as we wind up here tonight, I want to offer some hope. It is fascinating to me to read the Gospels and watch how Jesus interacted with people. Now, we often interact with others either in a measured way because that person might hurt us or they might say something unkind, and so we don't quite fully. But Jesus always fully engaged with people. Just wonderful to see him, to watch him. And he interacted with people that others avoided. Sinners, they call them. Tax collectors, prostitutes, the lame, the blind, you name it. And yet Jesus was comfortable hanging out with everyone. I love the picture of Jesus with children piling onto his lap. You know, he was a kid magnet. But he was criticized for how he behaved, right? But Jesus was the most self-determined person to ever walk the earth. He could have the deepest concern for people, and he could care less about what people thought. Can you live between those spaces for just a sec? We have been called to love others. And yet, we've also been called to lead the life God has called us to. God has called me to. And yeah, I want to factor in what those around me, especially those close to me, might say, because I'm going to learn stuff. But at some point, we can see Jesus living this wonderfully joyous life of living out the will of his Father, again, in relationship and dependence. Let's bow our heads and pray as we conclude. Lord in heaven, as we have explored a few topics that we'll continue to unpack this week, we are reminded that emotionally and relationally, we're pretty complex creatures. And we're thankful for that because it allows us to experience life and others in relationship. And yet, it can also be a great source of anxiety and fear. But Lord, you have not given us a spirit of fear, but you have given us a spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind to live and interact while on this earth as society around us becomes more and more perplexed and anxious. Lord, help us to be beacons of your grace inside us and also as we interact with others around us, we pray. Keep us all in your grace tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much, Craig. Appreciate that. It is time for our giveaway. And Craig, can I actually ask you, could you spin this around for me? Or, yeah, just kind of mix it up.
Okay.
And
Okay.
if you hold it, I'll stick my hand. If you hold it, I'll just
Okay.
kind of look away and.
My name's not in there.
All
so-
right. Paige Werner. Paige Werner. We have a giveaway for you here, so. Well, now you know. Every evening there will be a giveaway of some sort. We have a couple of gift cards. We also have a couple of copies of a book that is very meaningful to me. It's called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Excellent book. It kind of expands and includes some of what Craig will be speaking on this week. But yeah, we have a couple of copies of that to give away this week as well. So every evening at 7 p.m. till about 8:15, please come and join us. Thank you for coming to this evening, and God bless as you go.